Welcome to Season 3, Episode 14 of CSS Breakdown, book by book. In this final chapter of Michael Kimmel's Degendered Society, we turn our attention to the future one, where gender no longer limits what it means to be fully human. After exploring the intricate ways gender shapes our lives throughout this really profound book, the anticipation for this final chapter, well, it's palpable. What comes next? What lies beyond our current ways of thinking? It feels like a pretty weighty topic, maybe the most optimistic one, but also maybe the most challenging, because it asks us to fundamentally rethink things we often take for granted. So today, our core question for this deep dive is, what does a future society, one unbound by those traditional gender limitations, what does it actually look like? What are the gender arrangements, if gender even works the same way? Our mission here is to really distill Michael Kimmel's vision for this future. We want to move beyond some of the current debates, which can feel a bit circular sometimes, and dive into what's possible, what might already be starting to happen. And we're drawing our insights from specific excerpts from his book, Michael S. Kimmel, Degendered Society, specifically pages 418 to 423 in the 2011 Oxford University Press edition. And to set the stage, Kimmel himself kicks off this chapter with a really powerful quote. It's from John Stuart Mill from The Subjection of Women way back in 1869. Mill wrote, and I think it's worth hearing directly, "The principle which regulates the existing social relations between the two sexes, the legal subordination of one sex to the other, is wrong in itself, and now one of the chief hindrances to human improvement. And it ought to be replaced by a principle of perfect equality, admitting no power or privilege on the one side, nor disability on the other." Wow, that's incredibly bold even reading it today, isn't it? It still challenges us.
It absolutely is. And what's amazing about Mill's words, like you said, from over 150 years ago, is how timeless they feel. They just perfectly frame the aspiration Kimmel's exploring now. Mill's call for perfect equality, well, that's the bedrock principle for Kimmel's whole argument about the future. And Kimmel jumps right on that. He highlights this core tension he wants to tackle, this pervasive idea that gender differences are somehow intransigent, fixed, unchangeable. That belief, he argues, often leads to a kind of political resignation, a feeling that trying to achieve gender equality is, well, maybe pointless because that's just how men and women are. He really pushes back hard against that, especially what he calls the interplanetary model of gender.
Ah, yes, the men are from Mars, women are from Venus's idea.
Exactly. That's incredibly popular, but he argues fundamentally flawed notion that men and women are just so different, wired so unlike each other that they might as well be from separate planets. He's really challenging the idea that those differences are fixed, suggesting they're actually products of society and inequality.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. This different planets idea, it's everywhere, isn't it? Self-help books, casual chats. It implies this huge, unbridgeable gap. But Kimmel is so clear, so forceful in rejecting it. He says it's not just wrong, it's actually dangerous, because it leads straight to that political resignation you mentioned. It fosters what he calls an uneasy truce. Instead of seeking real understanding or equality, we just end up, as he puts it, exasperatingly accepting the inherent and intractable foibles of the other sex. It basically justifies keeping things as they are, unequal.
Yeah, lets the status quo off the hook.
Right. And who benefits from this truce? Kimmel points to ever wealthier psychological interpreters who claim they can decode the impenetrable language of the sexes. They essentially profit from the myth. But Kimmel just lays it out there. The evidence is clear that women and men are far more alike than they are different. He basically says we need far fewer cosmic interpreters and far more gender equality. He sees the future of gender differences as tied directly to the future of gender inequality. As inequality shrinks, so will many of those perceived differences.
And it's so important to get why this model is a problem, beyond just being inaccurate scientifically. If you connect it back to Mill's point about perfect equality, it's not just a harmless misunderstanding. It actively blocks progress. Because if the differences are inherent, immutable, divinely ordained almost,
then why try to change anything?
Exactly. It makes efforts towards equality seem unnatural, maybe even harmful. It directly contradicts Mill's vision because it implies there's a natural reason for power or privilege on one side or disability on the other. It conveniently shifts the focus from systems to individuals. So Kimmel's core argument really flips the script on how we usually think about this. We tend to think, okay, men and women are different, therefore inequality results from those differences. But Kimmel argues the opposite. He says, it is gender inequality that produces the differences we do observe, and that inequality also produces the cultural impulse to search for such differences.
Whoa, okay. Say that again. Inequality produces the difference.
Yes. It's not difference leading to inequality, but inequality actually creating and exaggerating the differences we perceive. And then, conveniently, those exaggerated differences are used to justify the inequality. It's a cycle.
A feedback loop.
Precisely. Think historically.
Yeah.
When women were confined to the home and men to the public sphere, well, the perceived differences in their abilities, their emotional ranges, they got amplified.
Right. Women were naturally nurturing, men naturally logical.
Because those were the roles assigned, often forced upon them, not freely chosen based on innate qualities. And Kimmel really hammers this home. Gender isn't some fixed thing you have. It's not like eye color.
Oh.
It's a set of relationships produced in our social interactions and, crucially, within gendered institutions.
Gendered institutions like
Yeah.
workplaces, schools, the legal system.
Exactly. Our formal organizations, their structures, their unspoken rules, even things like product marketing, they're often built around gender biases, sometimes obviously, sometimes subtly. Think about a typical corporate structure. Is it still implicitly based on having a partner at home handling everything else? That penalizes parents sharing caregiving, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Or how fields like engineering or nursing develop these historically gendered cultures. That affects who feels comfortable entering, who succeeds. These institutional norms don't just reflect differences, they actively produce and reinforce them, often without us noticing. It makes equality way harder to achieve. It's systemic.
And to really knock down that interplanetary model, Kimmel brings in history, hard evidence. He points out, for the past century, we have steadily moved to lessen gender inequality. And he's not talking small tweaks. He means big societal shifts, like removing barriers to women's entry into all arenas of the public sphere. And also, crucially, protecting women who have been victimized by violence or discrimination. And what happens when those barriers come down? We see women performing admirably in arenas once believed to be suitable only for men. He basically says, don't believe me, ask those women surgeons, lawyers, and pilots. Their success proves the old limits were artificial.
Right. It directly refutes that idea of inherent limitations.
And the flip side is just as important. Men succeeding in roles once seen as exclusively female. Kimmel says, think about male nurses, teachers, and social workers, as well as all those single fathers. And he asks rhetorically if they are capable of caring for their children.
The answer is obviously yes.
Exactly. It's a huge yes that affirms human capacity beyond gender lines. This whole historical trend, Kimmel argues, shows a significant gender convergence taking place over the past half-century, a real coming together.
Yeah, and that convergence is broad. It touches almost everything. Kimmel mentions growing similarities in sexual behavior. Attitudes are less rigid now. He talks about friendship dynamics, how both men and women are seeking and showing emotional intimacy in new ways, ways that challenge old stereotypes.
Okay.
And really importantly, efforts to balance work and family life. That's huge. Men getting more involved in childcare, domestic stuff, just as women build careers.
And education, workplace aspirations, too.
Definitely. Educational achievement, career goals, they're converging. Women are outnumbering men in many university programs now. Across all these areas, he says, the gender gap is growing ever smaller. The one big exception he notes, and this is critical, is violence, particularly gender-based violence. That remains a stark difference.
Right. We've covered that before.
But focusing on the convergence, what does this mean for you listening right now? For your daily life, your relationships? It means a lot of the assumptions we might just carry around subconsciously about how men and women should act, what they should want, they're increasingly outdated.
You don't match reality anymore.
Exactly. In our daily lives, we're constantly meeting people who defy those old stereotypes just by being themselves, doing jobs, living lives that wouldn't have fit the old boxes. This convergence is strong evidence that many differences we thought were innate gender traits are actually social constructs, and they're dissolving as equality increases. Gender isn't fixed, it's changing.
Okay, so if the different planets idea is out, and we see this convergence happening, what's next? Does that just mean we should all aim to be exactly the same, erase all difference? And this is where Kimmel brings in a really important nuance. He warns against one way of thinking about degendering that could actually backfire. He mentions Judith Lorber's idea of degendering as eliminating gender difference as a meaningful consequential component of institutions and identities. Now, on the surface, that might sound good, right? Eliminate difference as a consequence.
Seems logical, yeah.
But Kimmel critiques this specific take. He argues it equates equality with sameness. Only by flattening all differences will equality be possible. And he says that puts the cart before the horse.
Okay, how so?
He thinks true progress isn't about getting rid of difference to get equality. It's that difference will naturally become less important as inequality is eliminated. He says, and this is key, only by eliminating inequality will difference recede until the variations among us will prove largely epiphenomenal, meaning superficial distinctions, not justifications for hierarchy. Some differences might remain, sure, but they won't be used to discriminate.
That's a really different way of looking at it.
It is, and it leads us to the idea of androgyny. Some psychologists propose this as a solution, right? Implying a sort of flattening of gender differences. The idea being that men and women would act and think in more neutralized, gender non-specific ways. Masculine and feminine become old-fashioned concepts. Everyone just becomes generically human.
Right. And we should acknowledge the people pushing for androgyny, they do see that gender is socially constructed. They see change is possible. That's a big step.
Yeah.
But the problem, Kimmel argues, is that it would eliminate differences between people, mistaking equality for sameness. And for a lot of people, that idea of enforced sameness feels, well, coercive, unappealing, like a dilution of difference into a bland, tasteless amalgam.
It loses individuality.
Exactly. Kimmel uses this great analogy. He compares it to Hollywood's vision of communism as a leveling of all class distinctions into a colorless, amorphous mass. Like those old ads with everyone dressed identically and poorly.
Oh, okay, I get the image.
He says androgyny feels like it would create this flat and ultimately barren, degendered landscape. Which brings us to a really fundamental question for you, for everyone. Is the only way for women and men to be equal to become the same? Can't we imagine an equality built on respecting and even embracing difference?
That feels like a much more appealing goal.
It shifts the whole conversation, doesn't it?
It really does. So that distinction, equality not being sameness, leads Kimmel to his core point, the real reshaping of how we see gender. He says it's not that women and men need to become more like each other, it's rather that all the psychological traits and attitudes and behaviors that we as a culture label as masculine or feminine need to be redefined.
Redefined.
How?
Well, these labels, masculine, feminine, they aren't neutral. They carry positive and negative values. There's a hierarchy.
And it's through this hierarchy, this unequal weighting, Kimmel explains, that gender inequality becomes so deeply entwined with gender difference. Just trying to degender people doesn't fix the inequality if the traits themselves are still valued differently or rigidly assigned to one gender. The problem isn't having diverse traits, it's gendering them and ranking them.
Got it. So it's about the labels and the values we attach to them.
Exactly. And he shares this fantastic personal story that just nails the absurdity of it. He was in the park with his newborn son, just enjoying being a dad, and this well-meaning person comes up and says how wonderful it is to see men these days expressing their feminine sides.
Oh, wow. I can imagine his reaction.
Yeah, he describes this sort of internal growl under a fake smile. He wanted to say, I'm not expressing anything of the sort, ma'am. I'm being tender and loving and nurturing toward my child. As far as I can tell, I'm expressing my masculinity.
That's brilliant because it perfectly shows how ridiculous and, frankly, insulting it is to assign universal human qualities to just one gender.
Right. Why is being loving or nurturing feminine?
Why does he, as a man, have to be seen as borrowing from the other sex just to feel human emotions? He argues, look, because I'm a man, everything I do expresses my masculinity, changing a diaper, giving a talk, whatever. And he says his wife would be just as insulted if, after doing something intellectually demanding, someone praised her for showing her masculine side, as if competence or ambition aren't human traits women can have too.
It makes you realize how deeply embedded those labels are.
It does. And Kimmel is saying love, tenderness, nurturance, competence, ambition, these are human qualities.
Yeah.
All humans should have equal access to them.
Regardless of gender.
Exactly. And when we express them, we're just expressing our gender identities, our humanity, not mimicking anyone. He finds it a strange notion that we label these deeply human things as masculine or feminine. And this connects to what Kate Millett wrote back in 1969 in Sexual Politics, a really biting quote.
What did she say?
She wrote, "Perhaps nothing is so depressing an index of the inhumanity of the male supremacist mentality as the fact that the more genial human traits are assigned to the underclass. Affection, response to sympathy, kindness, cheerfulness."
Wow. That really hits hard, assigning kindness to the underclass.
It highlights the injustice, the dehumanization that happens when we gender-positive human qualities and then devalue them because they're associated with a subordinate group. It limits everyone.
It really does. And thinking about 1969, Kimmel brings this into the present with a personal reflection. Comparing his world to his father's, he says, "My father could have gone to an all-male college, served in an all-male military, and spent his entire working life in an all-male work environment. Today, that world is but a memory.
Such a stark contrast.
It really is. He points out the huge changes. Women have entered every workplace, the military, often leading the way. Almost all colleges are co-ed now, not as an exception, but as equals. And he stresses that these changes are permanent. Despite persistent efforts to turn back the calendar, he says, women will not go back to the home. The genie's out.
That feels true. The world is fundamentally shifted.
Yeah.
And Kimmel is convinced these changes will only pick up speed. He doesn't just hope for it. He sees it in the trend lines. He envisions the society of the third millennium will increasingly degender traits and behaviors without degendering people.
Okay, that's the core vision again. Degender traits, not people.
Exactly. It's a nuanced idea. He's not saying we become genderless. He says, we will still be women and men, equal yet capable of appreciating our differences, different yet unwilling to use those differences as the basis for discrimination or hierarchy.
So respecting difference, but not using it to create inequality.
Precisely. It's about seeing the full spectrum of human experience as open to everyone, no matter their gender identity.
Okay, so let's imagine that future where we keep degendering traits. Kimmel offers this scenario. He calls it maybe naively optimistic, but based on what's already happening. Picture kids growing up, seeing both their mothers and their fathers go off to work in the morning with no compromise to their masculinity or femininity. What's the takeaway for those kids? What sinks in? Kimmel says that those little boys and girls would grow up thinking that having a job, being competent, earning a living, contributing to society was something that grown-ups did, regardless of whether they were male or female grown-ups.
It just becomes normal for everyone.
Right, not something men do and women do only with guilt or difficulty. These kids will just think, and when I grow up, I'm going to have a job also. It universalizes ambition and contribution.
That's powerful.
And he takes it further, into the family. Imagine both mothers and fathers are equally loving and caring and nurturing toward their children. When nurture isn't just what moms do and dads do occasionally, then those same children will say to themselves, and when I get to be a grown-up, I'm going to be loving and caring toward my children.
Again, it normalizes it. Caregiving becomes a human thing, not a gendered thing.
Exactly. It's about changing the generational learning, the definition of parenting. It frees both parents to be fully involved. It's incredibly hopeful for raising kids outside those old, rigid boxes.
In connecting this back, Kimmel makes a really interesting historical point. He argues that whole 19th century idea of separate spheres, men public, women private, that was actually the weird phase, the historical aberration.
The anomaly, not the tradition.
Yeah, an anomaly. A big break from how things often were before, and maybe from our natural propensity as humans to share things and be complex. He says this explains the vehemence with which it was imposed. Think about that. Nothing so natural or biologically determined has to be so coercive.
That's a great point. If it were natural, you wouldn't need to force it so hard.
Right. It debunks the idea that those roles were timeless or biological. They were manufactured and enforced. Then the 20th century, he says, saw the challenge to separate spheres, led largely by women, those marginalized by it. And that led to this unprecedented upheaval in the status of women, maybe the biggest shift in gender relations ever. Getting the vote, the right to work, entering all these institutions.
Women really did shake the foundations.
They did, but Kimmel calls it only half a revolution.
Half. Why half?
Because while women transform their opportunities becoming workers and mothers, the system around them, and crucially men's roles, didn't keep pace. So this half-finished revolution has left many women frustrated and unhappy. They're caught in a bind, trying to be good mothers, often still primary caregivers, and successful workers in systems not designed for that. The have-it-all dilemma.
Yeah, the double burden.
Exactly. And what Kimmel finds amazing is the illogic of pundits who blame women's frustrations not on, say, the continued resistance of men to fully share domestic life.
Or institutions not changing.
Or politicians not creating supportive policies. No, instead, they blame the women themselves.
Yes.
For wanting to expand their opportunities.
That does seem illogical when you put it like that.
He notes how bizarre it is that some women in the media essentially argue for other women not to have careers, pushing for a return to the very system that caused the problems. It really makes you ask, why blame the people pushing for change instead of the systems resisting it? Why is it easier to say women can't have it all than to ask why society doesn't let them?
That's a really challenging question. So if that's the half-finished part for women, what about men? What does this mean for them?
Right. Kimmel argues that the second half of the transformation of gender is just beginning and will be far more difficult to accomplish.
Harder. What harder?
Well, he says there was a clear ethical imperative to expanding women's opportunities, fighting discrimination. It felt morally obvious to many. But the next phase involved the transformation of men's lives. And often that means letting go of traditional advantages. Privileges may be taken for granted. Embracing roles may be seen as less powerful, less masculine.
A different kind of challenge.
A very different kind. He sees men just beginning to realize that the traditional definition of masculinity leaves them unfulfilled and dissatisfied. That old script, stoicism, provide a role, emotional distance, it's limiting.
So the same ideology of separate spheres affected men too, just differently.
Exactly. Kimmel paints that picture. Women were imprisoned in the home by that ideology and left it, seeking balance. Men were exiled from the family by the same ideology, told their place was outside, providing. Now they search for a way back into the family.
Both sides impacted by the same restrictive idea.
Precisely. And men react in different ways now.
Yeah.
Some, he says, are hoping and praying for a return to the old gender regime, wanting that perceived simplicity back, which often fuels backlash.
Okay.
Others are exploring new paths, joining men's movements like Promise Keepers or the Million Man March, looking for community or spirituality. Or going to mythopoetic men's retreats, searching for a deeper meaning of masculinity.
Trying to figure out what masculinity means now.
Yeah, because that 19th century ideology didn't just limit women, it did profound violence to men's experiences too. It valued ambition, competition, stoicism,
Right.
but dismissed tenderness, empathy, vulnerability.
Leaving men feeling, what, incomplete.
Only partially fulfilled lives, Kimmel says, often cut off from family, from their own emotions. He thinks only recently have men really started to chafe at the restrictions that ideology placed on their full humanity. That's the challenge of the second half, men recognizing their own need for liberation.
Which brings us to Floyd Dell. Kimmel uses this amazing quote from him, written way back in 1917, over a century ago, but it sounds like it could be written today about the cost of these separate spheres.
It's incredibly powerful.
Dell wrote, "When you have got a woman in a box, it ceases to be a companionship. Half a life cooking, clothes, and children. Half a life business, politics, and baseball. It doesn't make much difference, which is the poorer half. Any half, when it comes to life, is very near to none at all."
Just stunning insight from Dell. It connects so perfectly to Kimmel's argument. Dell saw, even then, that separate spheres didn't just hurt women, they impoverished men's lives too. And notice how he starts. When you have got a woman in a box, he's talking directly to men, linking their actions to inequality.
Yeah, it's direct.
What's amazing is Dell saying, feminism will make it possible for the first time for men to be free. How does inequality impoverish both? By splitting life apart. Women confined, their labor unrecognized, ambitions suppressed, men forced into stoicism, focused only on providing, cut off from family intimacy and their own emotions. It makes life half. And Dell says any half is very near to none at all.
Breaking life apart.
Exactly. And that cycle, gender inequality produced the ideology of separate spheres, and the ideology of separate spheres, in turn, lent legitimacy to gender inequality. Dell saw it a century ago. Men's freedom is tied up with women's freedom. It's a shared journey to being whole.
So putting all this together, the history, the critique, the vision, what's the ultimate goal for the future, according to Kimmel?
The vision for this new millennium, he says clearly, is not for women and men to become increasingly similar, but rather for them to become more equal.
Equal, not same. Back to that key distinction.
Right. The goal is for those traits and behaviors heretofore labeled as masculine and feminine, competence and compassion, ambition and affection, to be labeled as distinctly human qualities, accessible to both women and men who are grown up enough to claim them.
Reclaiming the full range of human qualities from those gender boxes, a liberation for everyone.
Yes, and he calls this idea, or suggests it implies, a form of gender proteinism.
Proteinism, like Proteus, the shapeshifter.
Exactly. He defines it as a temperamental and psychological flexibility, the ability to adapt to one's environment with a full range of emotions and abilities. It links to Robert J. Lifton's idea of the protean self, someone who can handle difference, contradiction, and complexity, be flexible in a changing world, but still have a core self.
So adaptable, flexible, complex.
Yes. And the beauty of this gender proteinism is that it does not require that men and women become more like each other, but rather more deeply and fully themselves.
Fully themselves. That sounds good.
Think about it in practice. A workplace where leadership isn't just about aggression, but also empathy and collaboration traits may be once dismissed as feminine. How might that change things?
More inclusive, maybe better decisions.
Possibly. Or parenting, if both parents are seen as sources of nurture and discipline. What does that do for kids and for the parents themselves? It's about expanding the human experience, letting everyone be authentic, making society richer.
And what really gives Kimmel hope for this, what makes him optimistic, isn't just the theory. It's kids, their unfiltered views. He tells these great stories about his son, Zachary. They show this natural tendency towards degendering traits before society fully conditions us. Like when Zachary was 3, playing opposites with his grandma. Kimmel asked him, "Zachary, what's the opposite of boy?" He admits he tensed up, expecting the usual boy-girl, that Mars-Venus binary his book fights against.
And the answer?
The 3-year-old just looked at his grandma and said, "Man."
Wow, not girl, man.
Exactly. It completely sidesteps the gendered opposite. The young mind sees a simpler relationship age, maybe maturity, not intrinsic gender difference. It shows how those constructs are learned.
That's fascinating. It suggests a baseline understanding that's not boxed in yet.
Right. Then fast forward to Zachary at 10. Kimmel asks him the question he uses in workshops. "What do you think it means to be a man?" Zachary first says something about his soccer team. "You gotta be a man, be tough enough to play through the pain, so I guess it means being tough." That's the script, right?
A conditioned response.
But then Zachary stops, thinks harder, and he comes out with this incredibly insightful second thought.
What did he say?
He said, "Actually, Dad, I think it's not about being tough. I think it means acting tougher than you really are."
I'm a 10-year-old. That's profound.
Isn't it? He went from the simple script to seeing the performance of masculinity, the societal pressure, maybe even the cost. It suggests this generation is already questioning the roles, the act.
That's genuine critical thinking about gender right there.
Sure.
Amazing.
And one more quick story he shares from a colleague about her 6-year-old daughter in the car. The daughter asks, "Mama, how come on TV the women are always doing all the cooking?"
Kids notice everything.
They do. And when the mom asked what the men were doing on TV, the daughter just said, "All the other work."
Simple, clear observation of a perceived division of labor. Again, highlighting the patterns.
Exactly. These stories, Kimmel feels, are living proof that degendering traits is already happening, especially in kids' clear-eyed views. They see the inconsistencies, the roles people play. They aren't seeing difference as inherent yet.
It's really hopeful. They point towards that protean future where human qualities aren't tied down by gender labels.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we've really journeyed through Kimmel's vision for a degendered society. From Mill's call for equality, to busting the different planets myth, to that crucial idea that equality isn't sameness, but about redefining human traits beyond masculine and feminine. We looked at the half-finished revolution, how it affects both women and men, inviting men back to a fuller humanity, and those kids' insights. They offer real signs of hope that competence and compassion, ambition and affection can just be human qualities for everyone. It's not about erasing who we are, but expanding what we can be.
And when we bring this back to you, listening now, maybe take a moment. How do these shifting ideas about masculine and feminine play out in your own life, in your interactions, your work, your hopes? Kimmel's idea of gender proteanism, that flexibility, that ability to embrace a full range of emotions and abilities, feels really relevant for navigating our complex world, doesn't it? So here's a final thought to chew on. Reflecting on all this, what's one gendered trait you might reconsider in your own life? Maybe one you've held back because it didn't feel like your gender. Or, looking outwards, what's one trait you might see differently in others now, recognizing it as simply human, not tied to their gender? How could embracing this kind of gender proteanism help us all move toward that future equality? Kimmel envisions a future where equality means freedom for everyone to express their full, diverse human potential, free from those old arbitrary constraints.